Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly past the velvet curtain of time and find ourselves standing well teetering inside the perfumed drawing room of a Victorian townhouse. The walls are draped in tapestries, the gaslights flicker in sleepy rebellion, and somewhere beneath layers of silk whalebone and very questionable medical wisdom, someone is losing consciousness in the most polite way possible. You're surrounded by lace gloves, chintz upholstery, and the quiet warble of someone playing a parlor tune that's just a little too cheerful. The air smells faintly of rosewater and effort. There are sighs, faint coughs, and the subtle creak of a corset tightening somewhere nearby. Welcome to a time when looking faint was the height of social sophistication, and breathing freely was considered a luxury for peasants and widows. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a hesitant step across the creaking floorboards, and your boots, yes, you're wearing them, whether you like it or not, echo faintly through the drawing room. There's a surprising amount of bustle, pun entirely intended going on here. It's 1853, and everything from the shape of your sleeve to the tilt of your bonnet is saying something terribly important about your class, your taste, and possibly your mother's ability to find a good dressmaker. Across from you, a young woman, Eleanor, you think rises slowly from her tufted chair. Her waist looks suspiciously narrow. Not narrow like she jogs twice a week. Narrow like did she remove some ribs narrow. Her smile is polite but distant, the kind that says she's concentrating mostly on staying upright. A maid flits in the background holding a smelling salts vial just in case. Welcome to the golden age of fainting fashion. The Victorian era didn't just love a well-dressed woman, it demanded her. Everything from art to etiquette books upheld the ideal of the delicate corseted lady. And if she happened to swoon into a chaise lounge mid-sentence, even better. Of course, this wasn't just about aesthetics. A fainting woman was the embodiment of femininity, fragile, sensitive, and oh so delightfully dependent on others for support. Literally. Preferably a strong-armed gentleman who could catch her before she collided with the mahogany side table. The corset, or stays, as it was often called early on, had already been around for centuries by this point. But the Victorians perfected it, or rather perfected the art of denying its consequences. The moment you step into this world, you're stepping into a regime, a daily ritual. Get up, lace up, and accept that you won't be able to bend at the waist until further notice. And bending, by the way, is highly overrated. You glance toward a gilt-frame portrait of Queen Victoria herself, stern, unyielding, unbreathing. It's easy to forget that during this era, everything had a moral undertone. Posture wasn't just posture, it was a reflection of your character. Slouching moral weakness, a proud chest and cinched waist, self-discipline, purity, and quiet suffering. The corset wasn't just underwear, it was a spiritual exoskeleton. Historians still argue whether the average Victorian woman actually tight-laced pulling her corset so tight that her organs had to send each other apology notes. Some believe it was mostly an upper-class fantasy exaggerated by fashion plates and gossip. But whether the average waist was 24 inches or 18, one thing's clear, the pressure was real, even if the waistlines weren't. Let's pause for a second and talk about walking. No, really, walking becomes an Olympic-level task in a corset. Your spine has to remain upright. Your hips can only sway in pre-approved angles. And any attempt to dash, say, away from an awkward suitor is going to leave you breathless in about 4 steps. Not because you're out of shape, but because your lungs are being hugged within an inch of their lives by whalebone and hope. And speaking of whalebone, you get to know it quite intimately. This is no ordinary boning. It comes from the baleen plates of actual whales, boiled, shaped, and inserted into your garment to keep everything in place. It's as eco-unfriendly as it sounds, but hey, it bends without breaking, just like your spirit. Eventually, as you tiptoe around the furniture, trying not to knock over a teacup tower, you overhear a conversation. 2 ladies, both tightly cinched, are murmuring about the Duchess of so-and-so who fainted during dinner last night. Right into the pudding, one of them says entirely without irony, "You suspect that this might be considered a power move." Here's the thing, fainting wasn't always an accident. It was often expected, even admired. A dainty collapse could evoke sympathy, admiration, and most importantly, attention. You might not have a vote or a bank account or any legal autonomy, but you could still claim center stage for 15 dramatic seconds. Of course not. Everyone thought this was a good thing. Some health professionals, yes, they had. Those began sounding the alarm. Doctors warned of hysteria, corset liver, and organ displacement. A few even published illustrations of twisted spines and squashed intestines. These weren't exactly bedtime reading, but they made the rounds. Still, society wasn't quite ready to trade fashion for oxygen. Besides, if you fainted too often, you could always blame it on the vapors, or consumption, or excitement. There were plenty of reasons a lady might tip over. Why blame the thing literally strangling her torso? And then there was the corset's little cousin, the busk. This was a stiff insert, often ivory or wood, slid down the front of your corset to provide shape and rigidity. It was like having a small, unforgiving ruler wedged against your body all day. Some women even carried love notes or photographs tucked behind it, which is either deeply romantic or the most uncomfortable scrapbook you've ever heard of. Let's not forget the sound. Lacing up a corset isn't silent. There's the tug of fabric, the groan of threads, the breathless count of one more inch, just one more inch. And when it's finally on, there's the unmistakable sound of someone trying not to pass out while pretending to admire the wallpaper. You shuffle toward the window, now lifting a heavy curtain to peer outside. The street is misty. A lamplighter moves from post to post, his silhouette flickering like a shadow puppet. Somewhere down the street, you hear a carriage rattle by. Inside it, and no doubt, is another woman tightly corseted, gripping the side of the seat for stability as she tries not to fall into her own lap. And yet, for all this discomfort, dizziness, general compression corsets didn't fade away. They evolved, they adapted, they even became symbols of allure and empowerment in later eras. But that's a tale for another midnight. Tonight, you're here perched on a fainting couch, trying to remember whether you've taken your daily dose of nerve tonic and wondering if you'll make it through the next social call without someone having to catch you. Spoiler, you probably won't. You're still in the room. Or at least you think you are. Time works differently when your lungs are being mildly squeezed, like someone testing a balloon for leaks. The wallpaper seems to shimmer a bit. Could be the gaslight. Could be your blood pressure. The maid reappears with a tray of lemon water and delicate biscuits, but you're too busy contemplating whether you can take a deeper breath without undoing the last 30 minutes of lacing. Around you, conversation flows as steadily as a stream constrained by fashionably rigid riverbanks. Someone mentions the Duchess of Devonshire's waist. Someone else counters with Lady Carstairs, whose corset was rumored to be so tight she had a rib removed. Was it true? Probably not. But truth here is flexible, even if your torso isn't. It's becoming increasingly clear that corsets weren't just articles of clothing. They were social armor, status symbols, a nonverbal contract with society that said, yes, I understand the rules. I'm disciplined. I'm proper. I'm better than you. You glance down at your own bodice and realize you're signed sealed and severely compressed. Now let's back up a bit. Not in your corset, you can't actually back up physically right now, but in time. The Victorian corset didn't arrive out of nowhere. It evolved from centuries of earlier attempts to shape the body, the earliest being stiffened bodices and stays in the 16th century. But it was the Victorians who turned it into both an art and a science of restriction. The stakes got higher, the waists got smaller, the metaphors got harder to ignore. Corsets became the ultimate battleground of fashion identity and control. And you're smack in the middle of that war, laced up and loaded. Let's talk inches. The ideal Victorian waist was often illustrated as impossibly tiny, 16, 18, sometimes even 13 inches. For reference, that's about the circumference of a healthy pineapple. But here's the kicker. Most of these waists weren't real. The infamous wasp waist often came courtesy of artistic exaggeration, photo editing of the 19th century kind read tight belts hidden under skirts, and occasionally straight-up lies. Historians still argue whether most women actually tight-laced to such extremes or whether it was mostly myth reinforced by a competitive social game of who could look the most breathless at a ball. But even without those extremes, it's undeniable the average Victorian corset could reduce a woman's natural waist by 2 to 4 inches on a daily basis. That's enough to compress your stomach, shift your liver, and inspire more than a few fainting spells. And fainting, oddly enough, became part of the script. You weren't weak. You were fashionable. You weren't gasping for air. You were cultivating an aesthetic of delicate suffering. It was all very romantic in the way that slow suffocation in a perfume cloud might be romantic. Here's where things get especially spicy. The corset wasn't just about women's appearances. It was a public declaration of private virtue. A tightly corseted woman was presumed to be modest, chaste, and under control. Never mind whether she actually was. The corset said it for her. There's even evidence that some Victorian thinkers believed physical tightness would produce moral tightness. In other words, a disciplined body, a disciplined soul. This is the same logic that gave us cold baths as character training, and children should be seen and not heard as a parenting mantra. As you inch along the edge of the room, sidestepping a spindly tea table like it might bite you, notice another curious feature of this world corsetry wasn't just for evening gowns. Women wore corsets almost constantly, morning to night, in town and in the country, even during pregnancy, although thankfully maternity corsets were slightly less aggressive. Emphasis on slightly. Some even had health corsets marketed as orthopedic aids rather than fashion items. They were supposed to improve posture ease, back pain, and support weak muscles. In practice, they still compressed your lungs, but hey, at least they came in beige. Fashion plates of the era display impossibly narrow waists paired with full skirts, creating an exaggerated hourglass figure that delighted illustrators and likely tormented actual human spines. The volume below the waist was strategically used to make the waist look even smaller. It's the same logic that leads modern folks to take selfies from above. It's all about illusion, and illusions were big business. Corset makers were artisans, engineers, and miracle workers all at once. They developed patented lacing systems, custom molds, and even corsets with built-in bust enhancers. Yes, Victorian push-up bras existed. There were corsets for lounging, corsets for horseback riding, corsets for dancing, and even corsets for sleeping, which sounds like the worst bedtime story ever. Did some women actually sleep in them? Unfortunately, yes. Some believed that wearing a corset overnight would train the body to maintain a smaller waist, the way some people now wear night guards for their teeth. Only this involved metal whale cartilage and dreams of not rolling over too fast. By now, your ribs are aching in sympathy. You try to lean against the fireplace mantle, only to realize that leaning is a complicated action requiring core flexibility you don't have anymore. And this is where things get really ironic. For all the corset's association with beauty and control, it actually made women less mobile, less physically powerful, and more dependent on others. You couldn't lace yourself in alone, someone had to help you. You couldn't run, climb, or even laugh too hard without risking your seams. It was elegance at the cost of autonomy. But don't worry, there were corsets for working-class women too. These were usually made from sturdier materials like cotton or linen, often with fewer bones and less flair. But the concept was the same shape, the body shape, the woman. Even women who scrubbed floors were expected to look put together, as if polishing the baseboards and maintaining a perfect silhouette were equally important duties. Let's pause to appreciate the sheer daily grind of Victorian fashion. A middle or upper-class woman might start with her chemise, add a corset, then a petticoat or 2 or 3, followed by a cage crinoline or bustle, then her actual dress topped with gloves, boots, bonnet, and maybe a small brooch of someone she loved who also probably couldn't breathe. All of this in a room with no air conditioning and all before breakfast. And you're worried about finding matching socks. Now, not everyone was thrilled with the tyranny of the waist. There were quiet rebels, women who loosened their stays the moment they got home, or who wore a reform dress behind closed doors. But they were the exception. Most complied because compliance wasn't just about fashion. It was about safety, social, financial, marital. A woman who refused to corset could be labeled difficult, radical, or gasp, unladylike. Even Queen Victoria herself was said to wear corsets, though hers were likely more functional than fanatical. Still, if the Queen did it, so did everyone else. And so the waist war continued 1 inch at a time. You're beginning to understand why couches had fainting purposes, why servants carried smelling salts, why every ballroom had at least one discreet corner for quietly gasping into a fan. And yet in all of this constraint, there's something almost hypnotic about the routine. The careful pulling of laces, the strategic layering, the whispered measurements. It's a ritual, a daily performance, a way to shape not just your body, but your entire place in the world. You're standing straighter now. You can't help it. The corset does that for you. Your posture is impeccable, your silhouette exquisite, and your lungs, well, they've seen better days. You're still standing. Well, technically, it's more like you've been expertly propped. The corset does a lot of things support contour constrict, but one of its finest accomplishments is turning the human spine into a certified coat rack. You're not entirely sure where your natural posture went, but it's likely somewhere behind you, gasping for air. As you make your way slowly, deliberately toward the ornate divan in the drawing room, the room tilts just a little. Not because you're fainting, not yet, but because this was a life of angles, chin lifted, shoulders back, waist pinched, and opinions tucked neatly beneath layers of lace and etiquette. Now that we've talked about how corsets squeezed Victorian ladies into delicate flowers, let's look at the actual structure that did the squeezing. This is where the science, or at least pseudoscience, kicks in. Corsets weren't just pretty belts with ambition. They were serious architecture. Think suspension bridge meets body shaper. Early corsets used stiffened linen, then added wooden busks down the front to help flatten the stomach and keep the torso upright. But by the Victorian era, materials had evolved. You'd find corsets made from cotton or silk, boned with whalebone, actually made from baleen, the flexible keratin plates in a whale's mouth, or even steel. Yes, steel, because when you're fashioning the female form into a living hourglass, nothing says commitment like wrapping your ribcage in light armor. The front busk, a metal clasp that held the corset closed, could be snapped open, but lacing up the back did the real work. It was the tension in those crisscrossing ribbons that pulled the waist in and in and in. Some women used special hooks or pulleys to lace tighter. Others had a dedicated maid who knew the difference between comfortable enough to sit and tight enough for marriage proposals. And here's a delightful nugget of fringe history. Some corset makers sold training corsets to girls as young as 5. Historians still argue whether these were widespread or more of a niche horror show for the elite, but the fact that they existed at all tells you plenty about Victorian childhood. Imagine learning the alphabet while also learning not to breathe too deeply. Speaking of alphabet, here's a new letter for your body S. That's what the spine eventually became in many women who wore corsets day in, day out. The fashionable silhouette required not only a narrow waist, but also a prominent bust and an exaggerated rear, especially in the late Victorian and early Edwardian eras. Enter the S-curve corset designed to push the chest forward and hips back in a sort of perpetual swoon. It's like gravity was rebranded as fashion, and yet women didn't just tolerate corsets, they often loved them. Some even reported feeling uncomfortable without the familiar pressure. Imagine spending years with your torso in a firm handshake, only to have it let go. It would feel almost indecent, naked even. Of course, this wasn't just about physical sensation, it was about habit identity and belonging. You wore a corset because every woman around you wore a corset, because your mother had worn one, because your daughters would, because it meant you had values, aspirations, and a proper regard for your spinal integrity, or lack thereof. But let's not pretend all corsets were made equal. The elite had custom-fitted ones embroidered with little details, perhaps perfumed with lavender sachets slipped inside the lining. Working-class women had simpler, sturdier models. They wore them not just for fashion, but for back support during long days of labor. A tight corset might have been miserable, but it was often the only support structure available in an era before ergonomic anything. This is where we need to talk about pain. No, not the philosophical kind, though there's plenty of that too. We're talking real physical discomfort. Not everyone fainted dramatically into the arms of a waiting suitor. Some women just suffered quietly. There are accounts of indigestion, difficulty breathing, and even displaced organs. Autopsies from the era occasionally reported livers with grooves, literal indentations from long-term compression. And yet, like all good suffering in fashion, it was both normalized and romanticized. Medical professionals occasionally protested. Some doctors warned of corset disease, blaming the garment for everything from constipation to tuberculosis. There were debates in journals, heated pamphlets, and public lectures about the dangers of tight lacing. But often those concerns were dismissed as prudish or exaggerated until a fashionable woman collapsed in the middle of a garden party, which just made her seem mysterious and tragic. You might be wondering, where were the men in all this? Mostly nodding approvingly. The ideal female form was often described in terms of fragility and delicacy, and the corset delivered. Some men even sent their wives to waist trainers to achieve a more desirable shape. Others were indifferent. A few were openly opposed, not for health reasons, but because they believed the corset made women vain. Still, corsetry was largely a woman-to-woman institution, a mother teaching her daughter to lace properly, a friend sharing her tailor's address, an older sister adjusting the ribbons with a practiced hand. It was a rite of passage, a conversation without words. You're one of us now. Welcome to the squeeze. And squeeze it did. Corsets didn't just slim the waist, they lifted the bust, creating the illusion of youth, vitality, and good breeding. The Victorian ideal was not the strong, capable woman, but the delicate, curated one. Your body wasn't just yours, it was a public declaration of taste class and marital potential. But here's the real twist: for all its apparent conformity, the corset also offered a strange kind of power. Stay with me here. Wearing a corset made a woman visible in a particular way. It marked her as respectable, desirable, and well-kept. A properly fitted corset allowed her to enter social spaces, be admired, be acknowledged. Without it, she risked ridicule or worse, obscurity. The garment was both cage and key. And interestingly, some women manipulated that power. They played with proportions. They used corsets to express style, personality, even rebellion just within the strict rules. A scarlet ribbon tucked into the lacing, an embroidered heart near the hip, a waist cinched a little tighter than the norm just to make the other ladies blink. Still, it's hard to ignore the elephant in the very ornate room. Most of this was done to meet male expectations, and Victorian ideals about women weren't exactly subtle. You were meant to be graceful, obedient, soft-spoken, and pretty. Corsetry helped check every box. It was the literal molding of women to fit a fantasy. But fantasies change. By the late 1800s, murmurs of resistance grew louder. The rational dress movement emerged, advocating for looser clothing, functional design, and the right to breathe without accessories. Reformers argued that women's health and freedom were being sacrificed for shallow aesthetics. And slowly the world began to listen. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. You're still here in the quiet drama of the corseted world. Maybe you're on the divan now. Maybe someone handed you a fan. The gas lights flicker. Outside, a carriage rattles by. Inside, the laces hold fast, a silent promise that you belong. There's a strange elegance in this rigidity, a beauty in the limitation. The corset doesn't just shape your body, it shapes your pace, your gestures, even your mood. You speak softer, you sit straighter, you take dainty sips and smaller steps. Your very movements are edited into social acceptability. And yet, somewhere underneath all that silken structure, you're still you, gasping gently, dreaming of pajamas. You've stopped trying to inhale fully. There's no point. Your lungs are now on a part-time schedule, your stomach has been smushed into early retirement, and even your kidneys seem to be eyeing the exit. But hey, you look stunning. At least that's what the mirror says once the maid finishes adjusting your skirts, smoothing your gloves, and fluffing your sleeves into perfectly respectable poofs. Let's say you're about to attend a garden party, a lovely, respectable gathering full of croquet mallets, cucumber sandwiches, and casual displays of upper-class affluence. It's also where corsets really come into their own, because here, fashion isn't just decoration. It's armor, it's language, it's your silent resume, and tonight you're wearing your best. The gown is cream silk with pale lilac trimming. The corset beneath is matched in color, a quiet flex, and it's been laced with just enough severity to cause a pleasant pink flush in your cheeks. Not from rouge, from oxygen deprivation. But who's counting? As you glide across the lawn, taking tiny steps because your skirts are enormous and your rib cage is in captivity, everyone sees the result. The nipped waist, the straight back, the calm, ladylike presence. No one sees the stiffened boning pressing into your sides, or the aching spot between your shoulder blades, or the fact that you skipped lunch to fit into this thing. Corsets weren't just for the drawing room. They were mandatory for all public occasions. Women didn't leave the house without one unless they wanted whispers trailing behind them like a bad perfume. Even maternity corsets existed, complete with adjustable panels to accommodate growing bellies while still insisting on upright decorum, because heaven forbid a pregnant woman look too comfortable. But now that you're mingling among society, let's take a step back and ask, how did all this become the norm? Blame it on the Victorians' obsession with control. They were mad about structure, moral, architectural, social. Everything had a designated place: God, queen, husband, wife, chimney sweep. The corset was a physical embodiment of this love of order. It made the messy, unruly body look tidy, contained, civilized. Women were seen as naturally emotional, irrational, even unstable. A corset helped keep all that troubling chaos literally under wraps. It was a tool of discipline, like a chastity belt without the metalwork. Historians still argue whether the corset was more about beauty or behavioral control, but let's be honest, it did a decent job of both. Now imagine trying to rebel against that. Imagine standing up at this hypothetical garden party and saying, "Actually, I'd rather not crush my intestines to impress Lord Wafflebottom." You'd be the talk of the lawn, but not in a good way. There were, of course, women who pushed back. Enter the Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881. These were brave souls, doctors' wives, educators, reformers who argued that fashion should not endanger health. Their mission was simple: promote clothing that allowed the body to move, breathe, and maybe digest food. Shocking, I know. They proposed alternatives: looser corsets or none at all, more breathable fabrics, shorter skirts, ankle-length scandalous. Some even wore trousers, which caused spontaneous fainting in nearby gentlemen. These reformers were often mocked in the press. Cartoonists depicted them as frumpy, humorless killjoys, ladies who'd rather discuss ribcage flexibility than flirt with bachelors. And yet, they kept going, writing articles, giving talks, and slowly shifting public consciousness. Meanwhile, in private, more and more women began to adopt modified undergarments. Health corsets featured flexible panels and lighter boning. Some women loosened their laces at home, wearing corsets with less rigidity, unless they had to make a public appearance. And here's a delicious irony: some of the most vocal anti-corset reformers were still wearing corsets, just not as tight. You couldn't exactly show up to a town hall meeting about women's rights looking slouched and shapeless. Presentation mattered, even in rebellion. Let's detour for a moment into something peculiar: the fetishization of corsetry. Yes, even in the buttoned-up Victorian world, there were darker corners. Some women and men took corset wearing to extremes, not out of social expectation, but personal obsession. Tight lacing became its own subculture. Waist measurements under 18 inches were celebrated. Diaries from the time reveal meticulous records of waist reduction, lacing routines, and proud announcements of "achieved my smallest yet." Kathy Jung, known as the Corset Queen, lived well beyond the Victorian era, but her 15-inch waist has roots in this history. The notion of the hyper-controlled body, its limits pushed for aesthetic or erotic purposes, was seeded here. Some corset enthusiasts claimed they felt euphoric when fully laced. Others described the sensation as a kind of transformation, a shedding of oneself in favor of another. For some, the corset was sensual. For others, spiritual. Some were simply thrilled by the drama of it all. And while mainstream society might have scoffed at such extremes, it couldn't look away. In art, corseted women were everywhere: milkmaids with improbable waistlines, heroines fainting beautifully, opera singers standing impossibly tall under yards of brocade. The corset wasn't just a garment, it was a symbol of elegance, of control, of erotic restraint. And that control extended far beyond the waistline. A tightly laced woman moved differently, sat differently, spoke differently. Every gesture became deliberate. Pouring tea, reaching for a parasol, climbing into a carriage without face planting. The corset choreographed your day, turning the mundane into theater. But here's a charmingly weird bit: some corsets were worn on the outside. That's right, especially toward the later 19th century as dress styles shifted and bodices became more elaborate. Parts of the corset, or even the full thing, could be styled into outerwear. It was a fashion flex. Look at this exquisite boning detail. Also, yes, I'm still breathing. Barely. Corsets also adapted to changing technologies. As metalworking advanced, steel boning became lighter and more resilient. Lacing mechanisms improved. By the time the sewing machine was mainstream, corsets could be mass-produced with remarkable precision. This democratized corsetry, somewhat allowing middle-class women access to styles once reserved for the elite. But let's be real, mass production didn't always mean comfort. Cheap corsets often fit poorly and used rigid, inferior materials. For many women, the liberation of accessible fashion came with sharp corners and bruised ribs. Still, the corset endured. Even as whispers of women's suffrage grew louder, even as bicycles rolled onto the scene and demanded a whole new wardrobe, even as Queen Victoria herself aged out of the hourglass, ideal corsets remained, like a stubborn ex. You knew they weren't good for you, but they were hard to quit. And here's something else that's quietly astonishing. Not all corsets were about shrinking. Some were padded. Yup, corsets existed to increase the bust or hips for those whose natural shape didn't quite fit the day's aesthetic. Think of it as early body sculpting long before plastic surgery Photoshop or those terrifying waist trainer ads on Instagram. You weren't just restraining your body, you were shaping an image, one that would be judged the moment you stepped into public view. So here you are again, drifting through the garden party, sipping lemonade with a faint tremor in your fingers. A breeze lifts your curls. A gentleman compliments your silhouette. You smile, nod, and lean delicately on the back of a wrought iron chair, mostly because your legs are going numb and it's the only thing keeping you upright. Someone asks if you're all right. Of course you are. You're wearing your corset. Your fingers tremble slightly as you lift the teacup, partly from the delicate nerves of polite company, but mostly because your arms are growing numb. Your corset is performing its usual act, redistributing your organs like they're playing musical chairs while you, the gracious guest, maintain your small smile. Chin-high spine erect like a spine should be, if it weren't fused into position by whalebone and prayer. It's late afternoon now, and the garden is golden. Bees drone around the roses. Somewhere, someone laughs with the faint desperation of a woman whose underclothes are making direct threats to her ribcage. And behind every elegant posture, behind each flutter of a lace handkerchief or genteel giggle, lies the truth it takes tremendous effort to appear effortless. The Victorian obsession with appearance wasn't just about corsets, it extended into every crevice of the body. But the corset, well, it was the crown jewel of daily discomfort. Still, not all corsets were created equal. You could tell a lot about a woman's social status just by her stays. Let's take a peek at your undergarment drawer, shall we? There's the stiff, high-quality corset made of coutil fabric, a tightly woven cotton that can withstand the daily tug of war. It's reinforced with flexible steel boning, far superior to the older whalebone or wooden stays. This is what the well-to-do woman wears, made to measure, perhaps ordered from a department store's catalog or a trusted corsetier. The stitching is firm, the busk is polished. It even has embroidery entirely unnecessary but pleasing to the eye and a sign that you've got taste money, or at least a mother-in-law with both. Meanwhile, the working-class woman had something far more utilitarian, less about fashion, more about function. Hers might be homemade or acquired secondhand. It had to last, survive cooking fires, long shifts, kids' stairs, more stairs, and still leave room for Sunday service. It might be cut higher in the waist to allow bending, or even have small shoulder straps to help support a heavy bust while scrubbing floors. But whether poor or wealthy, corsets were largely non-negotiable. You were expected to wear one unless you were literally on your deathbed, and even then, some widows kept theirs on during mourning. You could be forgiven for removing it during childbirth, perhaps, but that was a gray area. And so, the morning ritual of corset lacing became a near sacred routine. If you had staff, a lady's maid helped you, pulling gently at first, then more firmly, like a tug of war, with your spine as the prize. If you were on your own, there was the mirror twist method, turning just enough to reach the back laces, tugging evenly, then readjusting every buckle and ribbon. Not so much getting dressed as engineering a structural realignment. Historians still argue whether Victorian women really laced themselves as tightly as modern myths suggest. Yes, there are extreme examples in museums, corsets with waists under 16 inches, but most everyday wear hovered around a more humane 20-24 inches. Still suffocating but not quite snap your spine like a twig territory. Where the debate gets thornier is around why they did it. Was it purely fashion? Was it about attracting a husband? Or did women genuinely enjoy the sensation, finding pride, even identity in the ritual? It's not as black and white as the lace trimmings would have you think. Some women swore by their corsets, claiming they provided support, confidence, and even relief from back pain. Others, particularly in private diaries, confessed to despising them. One woman compared wearing hers to being hugged by an iron snake. Another described loosening her laces at night as the only pleasure God allowed unmarried women. But public face mattered. You couldn't let discomfort show. Even the language surrounding corsets tried to mask their oppression in gentility. Corsets didn't hurt, they trained. They didn't deform, they enhanced. Pain was simply tightness. Fainting wasn't a medical emergency, it was delicacy. That's right, the classic Victorian faint, the theatrical swoon into a chaise longue, often played for laughs now, but back then surprisingly common. Was it always the corset's fault? Not entirely. Fainting was also a useful social strategy. Overwhelmed by a heated conversation, dramatic exit. Want to escape a marriage proposal, whoops, dizzy spell. Need an intermission from a dull party. Time to crumple gracefully into the nearest floral sofa. Bonus points if you landed without spilling your tea. But yes, tight lacing did restrict oxygen flow and compress the diaphragm. Some women passed out simply because they couldn't get a full breath for several hours. Others blacked out after standing too quickly. And let's not forget the horrifyingly fragile conditions of health. At the time, tuberculosis, anemia, poor nutrition. Add a corset to that, and you're basically gambling every time you try to walk uphill. Now picture the inner workings. A cross-section of the corseted body looks more like a jigsaw puzzle. Ribs curved inward, stomachs flattened like pancakes, the liver pushed sideways. Some medical illustrations show the heart slightly tilted, like it's trying to avoid eye contact with the rest of the digestive system. Medical professionals began speaking up, though not always with modern sympathy. Some simply complained corsets made it harder to examine their patients. Others scolded women for ruining their internal arrangement while ignoring the social pressures that forced them into those garments in the first place. There were doctors who condemned the corset, but often only in relation to fertility. Can't bear children, must be the corset. Menstrual issues, corset. Hysteria, definitely the corset. If women had an ailment and you couldn't explain it with leeches or melancholia, corsetry was the fallback scapegoat. Which brings us to one of the great Victorian contradictions. Women were expected to be fragile and graceful, but also fertile and robust, passive and quiet, but also a moral compass for the entire household, beautiful but not vain, restrained but not cold. And corsets helped stitch together those conflicting ideals into one wearable paradox. Even young girls weren't spared. Corset training could begin as early as age 5 or 6, especially among the upper class. A soft child-sized corset, sometimes called stays, would gently guide the growing body into proper shape, because nothing says childhood like vertebral manipulation and shallow breathing. There was even a period when parents believed corsets could improve posture and prevent spinal disorders. Children were bound into them like little upright dolls, encouraged to sleep in them, move in them, and above all else, never slump. Now that might sound extreme, but consider many modern cultures still obsess over posture. We still put kids in rigid uniforms. We still mold behavior through clothing. The corset just did it more visibly, more dramatically, with significantly more bruising. Here's a quirky side note, corsets weren't always hidden. In some women's magazines, corsets were photographed and advertised like prized possessions. They were beautiful, embroidered, laced with ribbon, adorned with satin bows. You might never show it in public, but by golly, you'd know it was exquisite under all that velvet. The corset became a secret luxury, an inner indulgence, long before lingerie marketers figured that out. And let's not forget, corsets had their own maintenance schedule. They had to be aired out daily, washed with care, dried slowly so the boning wouldn't warp. If you wore one too often without resting it, the fabric would stretch and the support would vanish. It was like owning a temperamental piece of armor, one that could betray you mid-waltz if not properly tended. Which brings us to the real daily agony movement. Imagine trying to reach for something high on a shelf when your spine can't bend, or descending stairs sideways because your corset prevents hip rotation, or dancing at a ball, feeling your lungs quietly wheeze behind your smile. And yet, they did. Women danced, played piano, walked for hours in layered skirts, taught children, ran households all in corsets, not because they were stronger than us, though maybe they were, but because they had no other choice. The corset was their passport to public life. Without it, they risked exclusion judgment or even unemployment. So tonight, as you unlace yourself slowly, maybe with the help of a trusted maid, maybe alone, you exhale a sigh that's been building for 12 hours. You let your ribs expand. You feel the sweat pooled beneath the boning. You hang the corset gently on its hook. And for a brief, blessed moment, you are simply a body again. The corset's off. Finally, you inhale wide and full, and your lungs respond like grateful balloons. Your body uncoils in ways you forgot it could. The evening air from the window feels almost scandalously free across your ribs. For a few blissful hours between dusk and sleep, you exist without compression. And yet, even in this moment of reprieve, something's off. You catch yourself standing too straight, holding your stomach in out of habit. Your reflection, a woman-shaped silhouette in the soft gaslight, looks unrecognizable without the structure beneath your dress. You feel oddly exposed, not just physically, but morally, as if proper posture were a virtue that dissolved with the laces. That's the secret power of the corset. Even when it's gone, it stays. Its invisible grip lingers in your muscles, your breath, your self-worth. You don't quite know how to carry your body anymore without its scaffolding. And in that awkward, slightly slouched moment, you understand this wasn't just fashion, it was identity. You weren't just wearing the corset, it was wearing you. By the late 1800s, corsets had become more than garments. They were social markers, medical controversies, tools of self-discipline, objects of desire, and battlegrounds for early feminism. But before we get to the rebels and reformers, let's explore how this deeply personal item became an actual industry. Enter the world of corset manufacturing. At first, corsets were handmade by skilled seamstresses or domestic servants. But as the Industrial Revolution crept its sooty fingers across Britain, corsets, like everything else, went mechanical. Steam-powered machines, metal eyelet punchers, and standardized sizing revolutionized undergarment production. Suddenly, you could walk into a department store, let's say Liberty or Harrods, and choose from a range of corsets labeled with charming terms like health model athletic or bridal. You could even send your measurements by post and receive one tailored to your figure, which is terribly convenient if you ignore the bit about being squeezed like a toothpaste tube. Corset companies popped up like lace-covered mushrooms. Warner's Symington's and the Royal Worcester Corset Company all produced models with poetic names like the Coraline, the Diana, or the Amazon. Some brands even hired actresses to endorse their corsets, posing with improbably tiny waists and mysteriously flushed cheeks. Advertising was, as always, a parallel fantasy. Corsets were described as light as a feather and ventilated for comfort. One ad showed a woman playing tennis in a corset tennis, her face aglow with the ease of movement that would in real life probably result in a cracked rib. But here's the thing, women bought them in droves, despite the discomfort, despite the debate, despite knowing that the waists in the illustrations were about as real as a Disney princess. They bought corsets because society told them their bodies were problems to be solved. Waist too thick corset, posture too lax corset, hips too wide corset, hips not wide enough special corset, arms soft, spine curved, bust unruly, identity uncertain. There was always a corset waiting in tissue paper. And this is where things start to twist, literally and metaphorically. Because corsets weren't just confining, they were also transformative. A tool, yes, but a weapon too. In the right hands, they became armor. Women began to use the corset as both submission and defiance. Take the rise of the tight-lacers, women who deliberately trained their waists down to extreme measurements, sometimes as small as 13 or 14 inches. They didn't just accept the corset squeeze, they sought it, embraced it, mastered it. To tight-lace was to perform femininity at Olympic level. It required commitment strategy and pain tolerance bordering on athleticism. These women often wore corsets nearly 24 hours a day, gradually cinching smaller over months or years. They customized their diets, soup, soft foods, tiny portions to accommodate their shifted stomachs. They slept on their backs, rarely bent at the waist, and rotated corsets like a soldier rotates boots. To outsiders, they were spectacle, freakish. But to their fans, yes, there were fans, they were living sculptures. Some even toured in public exhibitions. The famed Ethel Granger in the early 20th century achieved a 13-inch waist and was featured in the Guinness Book of Records. She wore her corset nearly her entire life. Her husband adored the look. One could debate whether that's romantic or deeply unsettling. Historians still argue whether tight-lacing was a personal fetish, a feminist act, or both. Was it submission to the male gaze or domination of it? Was it self-expression or self-erasure? The lines blur, and that's the point. What's fascinating is how the corset allowed women to manipulate how they were seen, to amplify certain traits, to hide others. And in doing so, they claimed some form of control in a world where they had precious little. A well-laced corset was both shield and stage. You could enter a room with power seduction or icy reserve, all depending on how your waist was shaped and your silhouette framed. And since society rarely let women speak their power aloud, the corset whispered it instead. Even corset color mattered. White was for purity, black for mystery, red for scandal, pastels for youth, blue for maternal calm. In some circles, matching your corset to your mood was considered a subtle form of social code, not unlike emojis, but stitched and boned. And let's talk accessories because corsets didn't travel alone. There were bust improvers, hip pads, and padding rolls to enhance the hourglass illusion. There were corset covers, delicate camisoles worn over the top to protect outer dresses from sweat and abrasion. And, of course, garters and suspenders could be attached directly to corsets to hold up stockings. In many ways, corsets were the Victorian version of shapewear meets tool belt. But they also held secrets. Tucked inside the lining, some women hid love notes, perfume sachets, emergency pins, even tiny coins or house keys. The corset was the one thing guaranteed to stay on you after all. Might as well make it practical. And then there were the corset piercings. Yes, that's a real thing. In rare fringe cases, particularly among fetishists or performance artists, piercings were made down the back in symmetrical rows, allowing ribbon to be laced through human skin like a corset. It's extreme, certainly not mainstream, and definitely not what the average Victorian housewife did before church. But it's a bizarre legacy of just how far the corset fantasy could go when blended with performance power and bodily control. It's also a reminder the corset didn't die with the Victorian age. Far from it. Even as the 20th century approached and whispers of liberation grew louder, the corset morphed. Designers softened the language, calling it a girdle or foundation garment. Steel gave way to elastic. The hourglass remained king, but the method evolved. Today you still see it on red carpets, in shapewear ads, on influencers in waist trainers. The tools have changed, but the impulse remains the same, to shape to shrink, to support or suppress, depending on what the world demands of your body. And that's the haunting legacy of the corset. It's not a relic, it's a mirror. Tonight, as you lie in bed, maybe under a heavy quilt ribs finally unbound, you think about the women before you, the ones who laced themselves tight for love, for fashion, for power, for survival. The ones who fainted into parlors and still showed up to run the house. The ones who whispered through breathless lungs, "This is who I must be." Maybe tomorrow you'll wake up grateful for the elastic in your leggings. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll eye your spine in the mirror and wonder with sleepy fascination what you might look like in satin boned and bowed. You wake up slowly, your dreams tangled with whalebone and ribbons, and for a moment you're still caught in that cinched world. Then you roll over stretch without restriction and relish the joy of fully expanding your lungs. You survived another night of vicarious Victorian tight-lacing. Congrats. But now comes the twist. Because for every woman lacing up with grim resolve or ruffled delight, there was another quietly plotting rebellion. You see, corsets didn't just shape bodies, they sparked movements. By the late 19th century, a quiet but persistent discomfort began rising not just under the ribs but in the social air. The idea that women had to wear these stiff, often painful garments just to be deemed respectable, well, let's just say it started to pinch. Enter the dress reformers. These weren't wild radicals in trousers, not yet anyway. Many were educated upper-class women, ladies who attended lectures, read feminist tracts, and drank a polite amount of sherry while organizing sewing circles for change. They didn't want to torch society, just loosen its laces. The dress reform movement asked a bold question: what if women's clothing didn't actively harm them? It began with anatomy. Doctors, some progressive, others just grumpy old men, started publishing articles claiming that corsets deformed the spine, displaced organs, and compressed the lungs. Medical diagrams with ghostly female torsos and sad-looking kidneys became common in reformist publications. You could almost hear the spleen whispering, "Please, not another hour." Some doctors even claimed corsets could cause hysteria or infertility. Whether these diagnoses were scientifically sound or wildly speculative is still up for debate. Historians continue to argue whether the medical claims were legitimate or part of a broader control narrative. Either way, the fear worked. Mothers began loosening their daughters' corsets. School uniforms were occasionally redesigned with less structure, and perhaps most daring of all, some women stopped wearing them entirely. Cue the gasps. To refuse a corset in public was more than a fashion faux pas, it was a political act. A woman without a corset was assumed to be loose, unkempt, perhaps even dangerous. After all, if she didn't control her waistline, what else might she fail to control? This is where Amelia Bloomer struts in metaphorical trumpets sounding. She didn't invent the bloomers that bore her name, but she popularized them, a sort of Turkish-style pantaloons worn under a shorter dress. Bloomer advocated for comfortable, breathable clothing for women, including ditching the corset altogether. Did society embrace this bold, rational fashion revolution? Of course not. Cartoonists had a field day. Women in bloomers were mocked as unfeminine, mannish, and unhinged. Men wrote furious editorials about how the female form was sacred and should not be corrupted by bifurcated garments. One even warned that bloomers would lead directly to gender anarchy. But here's the kicker: some women wore them anyway. They joined walking clubs. They rode bicycles, those newfangled machines that required gasp straddling. And they started to realize something simple but radical: clothes that allow you to move also allow you to live. Meanwhile, corset manufacturers weren't about to go quietly. They pivoted. Instead of denying the health concerns, they created new hygienic corsets marketed with medical approval and designed to be supportive rather than constrictive. Some were endorsed by actual doctors, others by the kind of guy who puts PhD in his name after one correspondence course in bone alignment. These new models boasted innovations like flexible boning side lacing and even front busks that promised easy removal, because obviously what women really needed was to faint more conveniently. Still, the reform movement trudged on. Schoolgirls wore looser bodices, artists painted freer forms, and dress reform societies popped up across Britain, Europe, and America, quietly sowing the seeds of something revolutionary: bodily autonomy. At the heart of it all was a growing understanding, still embryonic but undeniable, that women's bodies were not public property, that their silhouettes weren't social contracts, that maybe, just maybe, they had a right to take up space. But it wasn't just ideology fueling the reformers. It was science, sort of. Victorian science was a strange brew of observation guesswork and deeply gendered assumptions. One popular belief was that women had limited energy and their bodies needed protecting from overexertion. Hence, the corset, it supported fragile female frames. Except new research was beginning to suggest that maybe, just maybe, women weren't delicate at all. Female athletes, mountaineers, and even polar explorers, yes, really began appearing in newspapers and lecture halls, corsetless and thriving. Even Queen Victoria's own daughter, Princess Louise, was rumored to support dress reform in private. And when royals start questioning the status quo, people take notice, or at least they gossip about it over scones. Still, the corset clung on, in part because women themselves clung to it. That's the uncomfortable truth reformers had to grapple with. The corset wasn't just imposed from above, it was desired. Women who had grown up with it didn't always see it as oppression. For many, it was tradition, elegance, self-respect. A good corset was like a daily ritual, comforting in its familiarity, even if occasionally breathless. To cast it off meant to cast off more than boning and buckles. It meant stepping outside the known world. Even so, the cracks widened. Fashion began to flirt with the idea of comfort, a word previously reserved for slippers and deathbeds. Designers like Charles Frederick Worth toyed with looser silhouettes. Tea gowns, those floaty, corset-optional dresses worn in the privacy of one's home, began to sneak into public view, especially among the more bohemian set. If you were an artist's muse, a wealthy widow, or just slightly scandalous, you might waft into a salon uncorseted and unapologetic. And then came bicycles, sweet, scandalous bicycles. Suddenly, women needed to bend, steer, and gasp pedal. Corsets were not invited. Rational dress took the handlebars and never looked back. Bloomers made a small comeback, along with looser chemises and knit corset alternatives. One could now be active and clothed, a radical 2-for-1. The corset wasn't dead yet, but it was wheezing. Its dominance was slowly shifting from social obligation to stylistic choice. Some still wore it daily. Others phased it out. A few packed it away for special occasions, like how you might now store heels you never wear but refuse to toss. One reformer, Lady Harberton, famously said, "The corset is a prison, and every woman her own jailer." A bit dramatic perhaps, but not untrue. So, tonight as you drift beneath your covers, think of the brave few who unfastened their stays not with a sigh, but a speech, who risked being mocked, ostracized, or simply ignored, all for the chance to breathe deeper, move freer, live fuller, and maybe whisper a thank you to the pant-wearing ghosts of reformers past. Because thanks to them, you don't have to lace your lungs to feel like a lady. Your dreams are starting to breathe a little easier now. No whalebone pressing into your ribs. No sighs of "tighten it more, please." But before you float too far, we're pulling you gently back down. Because just when corsets seemed on the verge of loosening their grip entirely, they shapeshifted again. And this time, they didn't just stay under the surface, they came out to play. It's the late Victorian twilight slipping into the Edwardian morning. The streets smell like coal dust and toasted crumpets. Society is changing, telephones are ringing in new ideas, and women are no longer content to sit in the drawing room waiting for oxygen and a husband. Yet corsets persist, but they evolve. Now you're introduced to the S-bend corset, sometimes lovingly and sarcastically called the health corset, because who doesn't want a little spinal distortion with their wellness routine? Unlike earlier Victorian styles that created an hourglass by nipping in the waist and lifting the bust, the S-bend forces the torso into a forward-tilting bust and an aggressively arched lower back. Picture your spine in a dramatic swoop, like a swan mid-curtsy, or maybe like a question mark drawn by a very confident toddler. It was marketed as a solution to the health concerns of previous corsets. No more pressure on the waist, claim the ads. Instead, the abdomen is pushed in, the hips out, and the chest forward. Sounds restful, doesn't it? Doctors and fashionistas alike were divided. Historians still argue whether the S-bend was an improvement or a lateral move from one form of fashionable punishment to another. Some praised it for giving the lungs room. Others accused it of sabotaging digestion, distorting posture, and making women walk like wind-up dolls. And yet women adored it. You see them now parading down city streets in flowing white lawn dresses, all cinched and curved like living sculptures. The silhouette became so iconic, it was immortalized in postcards, fashion plates, and even early films. The Gibson girl, illustrated flirtatious and very upright, becomes the aspirational fantasy of the Edwardian age. Strong, independent, but still heavily corseted. It was the ultimate contradiction, a woman stepping into modern life equipped with a telephone and a college education, but still trussed up like an antique chair. Corset manufacturers had kept pace. They introduced elastic inserts, hook and eye closures, and new fabrics that claimed to offer flexibility without sacrificing the holy silhouette. One popular model even came with ventilation gussets, which sounds more like a submarine feature than lingerie. But let's not get too smug. You have your own version of this, don't you? That shapewear in your drawer, the jeans you have to lie down to zip, the bra that claims to lift and separate like your chest is in couples counseling. Corsets didn't vanish, they just reincarnated. Still, in Edwardian times, the winds of change were picking up speed. Women were marching not just down the promenade, but through the streets with protest signs. The suffragette movement was swelling. So was the bicycle craze, still going strong and now turbocharged by mass production. Freedom of movement was becoming trendy, and that terrified the establishment. Articles appeared fretting about loose women, and not just morally. Clothing was literally becoming looser. Blouses were blousing. Waistlines were creeping downward, and with each fabric fold, the corset's dominance slipped just a bit further. Now imagine this: you're in a department store in 1910 surrounded by mannequins. There's a lingerie section filled with contradictions. On one side, steel-boned, lace-covered corsets promising the perfect figure. On the other, the new brassiere, a flimsy thing, marketed to young girls and delicate matrons, sold as a gentle support garment. It was the beginning of a split. Younger women, buoyed by suffragette ideals and new work opportunities, began opting for lighter undergarments. Meanwhile, traditionalists held firm, clutching their corset busks like rosary beads. Even within families, generational clashes emerged. Mothers insisted on propriety and posture. Daughters insisted on breathing. Corset companies fought back, of course. Some launched anti-brassiere campaigns, warning that these flimsy straps would leave women unsupported and undesirable. Others simply adapted branding corsets as modern, the perfect base for the new chemise-style dresses of the 1910s. Meanwhile, in the shadows of corset ads and department store displays, whispers of war stirred. World War I changed everything. Corset production slowed as metal was redirected for bullets, buttons, and battleships. Women flooded into factories' offices and hospitals' workplaces where tight lacing wasn't just impractical, but dangerous. Try adjusting a machine press while balancing in a steel-boned vise. Not ideal. Governments even encouraged women to give up corsets for the war effort. One ad pleaded, "Give up your corset for victory," as if a free-floating waistline might personally help defeat the Kaiser. But here's the twist: many women never went back. The post-war period was a corset-light zone. Not corset-free, mind you, plenty still wore them, but the shape had softened. Silhouettes turned tubular, waists dropped, and the old hourglass gave way to something looser, jazzier, and shockingly straight. The flapper arrived. She smoked, danced, swore, and wore dresses that hung like elegant sacks. She laughed in the face of S-bends and bustles, and under her sequins, usually a bandeau bra and a silk slip. No corset in sight. Now, don't get ahead of yourself. Corsets didn't vanish entirely. They lived on in theater high society and bridal wear, but for everyday life they had begun their long retreat. The flapper didn't just change fashion, she shifted expectations. You see, for centuries, the corset had been a kind of promise: wear this and you'll be beautiful, desired, proper, contained. But now there were other ways to earn your place through style, wit, or a really good Charleston. Still, not everyone celebrated this shift. Some older commentators bemoaned the decline in ladylike refinement. One grumpy fashion critic wrote that women were melting into formless sacks, which sounds harsh until you remember he was probably wearing 3 layers and a monocle. And even among the young, not everyone embraced the change. Some clung to corsets as symbols of structure in a chaotic world. The 1920s were wild, yes, but the old values didn't vanish overnight. Corsets remained, even if in smaller numbers, and those who wore them did so with a sense of continuity, a quiet defiance. It's funny how clothing holds emotion, isn't it? For some, corsets were cages. For others, they were armor. For many, they were simply normal, like wearing shoes or brushing your hair. You didn't question it. You just did it. And when fashion changed, it wasn't always liberation. Sometimes it felt like loss. But the pendulum had swung. By the end of the 1920s, the corset had gone from universal to optional, from essential to eccentric, from whispered scandal to historical artifact. And tonight, as your body softens into the mattress and your breath deepens without resistance, you're living proof of that transformation. No laces, no whalebones, just skin air and the gentle rustle of sheets. You made it to the other side of the S-bend. Your spine thanks you. You're lying there, no longer bent into an S shape or gasping under the weight of social expectations and polished steel. But don't get too relaxed just yet, because corsets, while retreating from daily wardrobes, were far from finished. They were just regrouping. In the shadows of flapper fringe and jazz-soaked speakeasies, corsets waited patiently, or to be more accurate, they rebranded. Like an aging rock band switching to acoustic guitar, corsets ditched their harsher edges and softened into something more palatable for modern tastes. Enter foundation garments. It's the 1930s. The Great Depression has tightened more than belts. It's squeezed waistlines, wardrobes, and entire futures. Yet amid the rationing and economic gloom, women's fashion takes an odd turn. Instead of doubling down on flapper freedom, it tiptoes back toward structure. Silhouettes lengthen, waists return, and the ideal body morphs once again. Only this time, the corset doesn't scream for attention. It whispers. You find it now under names like girdle foundation or the very charming step-in. And instead of being laced and boned, it's stitched and zipped, streamlined, sleek, and disturbingly elastic. The ideal isn't the exaggerated hourglass of the 1890s or the androgynous slink of the 20s, but something in between: soft curves, a gentle waist, a smooth line under a rayon dress. It's a new kind of control, and just like before, it comes with a price. Women are once again encouraged to mold themselves to a visual ideal, except now it's all about the invisible line. No boning shearer, but try walking upstairs in a full-body girdle with garters clipped to your stockings. Not exactly a jog in the park. But it's modern, and that's the trick. By this point, corsetry isn't sold as a moral duty or a sign of class. It's advertised as scientific. You're not being bound, you're being supported. It's not vanity, it's hygiene. You're not cinching, darling, you're streamlining. Magazines toot figure faults, and the latest figure fixers to correct them. Posture diagrams litter women's pages. Radios hum with advice on keeping your waist firm and your bust perky. Even Hollywood gets involved. Oh yes, Hollywood. The silver screen creates a new wave of aspirational torsos. Think Jean Harlow's curves, Greta Garbo's elegant lines, or Mae West's unapologetic bombshell vibe. And behind every starlet's gown, you guessed it, a carefully fitted foundation garment. One costume designer reportedly kept a drawer full of custom corsetry and could lace an actress mid-scene change with the efficiency of a pit crew. Now here's a quirky little gem. In 1939, a U.S. company introduced a corset made with actual inflatable pads to enhance hips and bust. Yes, a personal flotation device for your vanity. You could walk into a party looking average and with a few puffs and pumps leave as a curvaceous goddess. Historians still argue whether anyone actually wore it or just enjoyed the novelty in catalog photos. And while we're on it, let's not forget the rise of brasiers. No longer flimsy underthings for debutantes' bras in the 1930s were industrial marvels. They came in cup sizes, a bra sizing revolution that began in 1932. A BCD, suddenly your chest had a letter grade. No pressure. Corsets and bras began coexisting, each picking up where the other left off. The corset slimmed the waist and hips, the bra hoisted the bust, and together they manufactured a body that was, well, almost no one's actual body. By the 1940s, this ensemble became practically mandatory. And then, boom. World War II. Everything changed again. Metal went to tanks. Nylon went to parachutes. Women went to work. Suddenly, you're in a factory riveting airplane wings or in a hospital folding gauze with speed and purpose. There's no time to wriggle into a full corset, but the idea of support that sticks around. The girdle doesn't disappear, it just gets more utilitarian. One ad from the 1940s depicts a woman in factory gear, smiling confidently with the caption, "She wears her girdle to work. It helps her do her job better." Somehow, being compressed is patriotic. Corsets, now mostly called girdles or corselets, are redesigned for efficiency. Rubberized materials like lastex offer stretch without boning, and fashion houses crank out versions that can be worn under uniforms. You're cinched, but you can still lift munitions and handle a welding torch. Equality-ish. And when the war ends, guess what comes roaring back? Glamour. The late 1940s and 1950s usher in the golden age of the hourglass redux. Christian Dior's new look lands like a stylish bomb in post-war Europe. Tiny waists, full skirts, soft shoulders, and yes, foundation garments. You don't just wear a dress, you build the body to wear the dress. Now your undergarments are a team effort high-waisted girdle bullet bra, maybe a waist cincher for drama. You zip, hook, and shimmy until you're a living sculpture. Ads in women's magazines promise effortless elegance, though the number of hooks involved could rival a medieval gauntlet. There's even a debate among historians whether this return to structured clothing was a backlash against wartime gender roles. Did society use fashion to push women back into the domestic mold? Possibly. Or maybe after years of work boots and ration cards, women simply enjoyed the luxury of dressing up. Either way, corsetry, though modernized, is now a central part of mid-century femininity. Girls as young as 13 are fitted for their first girdles. Wedding trousseaux include matching long-line bras and lace corsets handed down like sacred heirlooms. And yet even now, the pushback is growing. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the youthquake begins rumbling. Young women crave freedom of thought, of expression, of movement. Elvis swivels his hips on television, and suddenly restraint looks old-fashioned. Underwear starts to shrink. Literally, girdles are still around, but looser, thinner. The rise of ready-to-wear fashion means you don't need the same sculpted figure to pull off a look. And more importantly, women start questioning why they should. And then the tipping point, the 1960s. But whoa, you're not there yet. You're still gliding through the thickly powdered elegance of the 1950s. Your torso is snug, your lipstick precise, and your silhouette, depending on your income and patience, carefully engineered. You know what's coming next. You've seen it in movies. You've worn stretchy pants and wireless bras. But here, in this moment, corsetry is holding on gracefully, elegantly, but tightly. Before you slip off into dreams of polka dots and Tupperware parties, know this: the corset is no longer the tyrant it once was. It's become a negotiation, a conversation between comfort expectation and identity. Some women still love the embrace, the lift, the ritual. Others quietly rebel, skipping hooks and stiff panels for the sweet freedom of cotton briefs and a slouchy tee. But the corset isn't gone. Not yet. It's just changing. Again, the 1960s arrive with the suddenness of a rock concert crashing through the tight-laced niceties of the previous decades. You're drifting through a world buzzing with change, vinyl spinning, protest signs waving, and yes, a very noticeable loosening of what goes under your clothes. The corset, well, it's no longer the empress of the undergarment kingdom. Instead, it's become a relic, a costume, or a niche luxury item. The new queen: comfort, liberation, stretch fabrics that bend and breathe, with you, not against you. It's the decade when no bra starts trending, not just as a rebellious act, but as a statement about freedom and natural beauty. Women toss away their wired constrictors in favor of soft braise camisoles or nothing at all. The youthful energy of the time couldn't be held down by boning or busks. Fashion magazines begin to showcase the slender, almost boyish silhouette favored by models like Twiggy. Corsetry's bulky contours are out. Minimalism is in. Yet here's a curious fact. Despite this cultural shift, designers like Mary Quant and André Courage sometimes flirt with corset-inspired looks, not to restrict, but to accentuate lines or to shock. Historians still argue whether these were true tributes or ironic fashion statements. Meanwhile, underground movements start reclaiming corsetry, this time for entirely new reasons. Some women and men adopt corsets in subcultures like punk and goth, using them as symbols of identity and rebellion rather than conformity. Here, corsets become a statement, a loud whisper that says, "I control my body on my terms." On the runway, corsets begin their slow evolution into fashion statements rather than necessities. Designers play with sheer panels, leather straps, and lace overlays, turning what once was a symbol of restriction into a tool of empowerment and artistry. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief in women's underwear drawers worldwide. The era of foundation garments has faded, replaced by something lighter, more flexible, and crucially more aligned with individual choice. Yet some challenges persist. The pressure to conform to a certain body ideal hasn't vanished, merely shifted shape. Now it's less about squeezing into a tiny waist and more about sculpting a toned physique through exercise, diet, or cosmetic surgery. But the shadow of the corset lingers, a reminder that the body has long been a site of negotiation, control, and yes, rebellion. And here's a quirky tidbit to tuck into your mental corset pocket. In the late 1960s, a company released a corset bra designed to combine the support of a corset with the freedom of a bra. Imagine that it promised all the comfort of a bra with the elegance of a corset. Whether anyone wore it outside of a catwalk is still debated. So, as you relax deeper, feel the weight of history of all those corset laces pulled tight and then loosened, of bodies contorted and freed. The journey from Victorian tightness to modern choice is long and winding, full of contradictions, humor, and surprising resilience. Your body right now is living proof of that legacy. As you sink further into this soft narrative flow, let's take a moment to peer into the curious realm of corsetry revival, a phoenix slowly rising from the ashes of history and comfort, because just when you thought corsets had retired gracefully into museums and vintage shops, the late 20th century had a surprise in store. By the 1980s and 90s, corsets make a comeback, but not as the obligatory torture devices of yore. No, they reemerge in the wildest corners of fashion music and pop culture, thrust into the spotlight by punk rockers, glam artists, and runway rebels. Suddenly, the corset is less about submission and more about expression, rebellion, and even empowerment. Picture this Madonna, the ultimate provocateur, sashaying across stages in tightly laced corsets, blending sexuality, performance, and defiance. You're watching music videos where the corset is not a hidden undergarment, but a flashy, intentional centerpiece, almost a badge of identity. It's a drastic shift from Victorian ladies swooning behind silk screens. And what's really fascinating is the psychological flip. Whereas once corsets signaled social status and moral virtue, or enforced painful ideals, now they often symbolize the opposite: control over one's image, owning your body, wielding a lure like a weapon or shield. Still, corsets didn't just live in concert halls and fashion mags. They made their way back into intimate spaces. The booming lingerie industry rediscovered corsets as glamorous, sensual pieces rather than mere shapewear. A corset became an accessory, an invitation, a way to feel powerful without needing to faint or pass out. But it's not all glitz and glamour. Some fashion scholars point out that the revival isn't purely nostalgic or liberating. They highlight the persistent tension between fashion as freedom and fashion as constraint. Is wearing a corset a statement of empowerment or a nod to societal pressures to sculpt the female form? Historians still argue whether this modern corsetry revolution truly breaks free from old patterns or simply repackages them. And here's a fun fact for your drifting thoughts. In 1987, British designer Vivienne Westwood included corsetry elements in her punk-inspired collections, intentionally mixing bondage gear with historical undergarments. It was a direct challenge to conventional ideas of femininity and fashion norms, and it made corsets both sexy and politically charged. Even today, corsets flirt with the boundaries of subculture and mainstream. You might see them on a runway, a goth club, or a cosplay convention, each context giving them new meaning. Yet, even as corsets are reinvented, the original purpose echoes faintly beneath the modern lace and satin, a body shaped by culture history and the endless negotiation between freedom and form. So, as your mind begins to wander toward softer dreams, remember that every corset is more than fabric and boning. It's a story. Your story woven into centuries of whispers, sighs, and silk ribbons. Now, as you sink even deeper into this gentle storytelling tide, let's travel into the fascinating world of corset construction and the remarkable craftsmanship behind those tight little masterpieces. Because if you think a corset is just fabric and laces, you're in for a treat. You probably won't survive the sheer detail of Victorian corsetry without a slight nod to admiration or a gasp at the obsessive precision involved. Corsets were engineering feats handmade by expert corseteers who understood bones curves and pressure points better than most doctors of the time. Typically, a Victorian corset used dozens of steel or whalebone stays sewn into channels within the fabric. These stays, often curved like ribs, provided the necessary rigidity to shape and support the torso. Think of it as a wearable skeleton, only less fun to remove at the end of the day. But here's where it gets delightfully quirky. Some corsets included busks, flat, rigid strips that ran down the front, often made of wood, bone, or metal, designed to hold the corset straight and help it close securely with hooks. Some busks were even elaborately carved or inlaid, turning a painful garment into a secret work of art. Beyond the basics, corsets were tailored to individual bodies. A wealthy woman might have several custom-fitted corsets, one for day wear, one for evening, and perhaps a special tight-lacing corset to whip her waist into an enviably tiny shape. The idea of mass-produced corsets didn't really take hold until the late 19th century. Meanwhile, ordinary women often relied on simpler versions or hand-me-downs, adjusting their laces as best as they could. And for those without access to skilled corsetiers, the fit could be less than perfect, leading to discomfort bruises or worse. Historians still argue whether the health risks attributed to corseting, like fainting spells, internal organ displacement, or poor digestion, were as widespread as popularly believed or exaggerated by Victorian moralists and later critics. After all, women have always pushed fashion boundaries, sometimes at the expense of comfort. A fun little nugget: some Victorian corsets came with secret pockets sewn inside tiny compartments, perfect for hiding love notes, coins, or emergency smelling salts, because fainting was unfortunately quite the spectacle. Imagine having a hidden stash in your undergarment. And speaking of fainting, remember that dramatic swoon trope. It wasn't always just melodrama. Victorian ladies often carried smelling salts to revive themselves after a corset-induced dizziness episode because no one wanted to miss tea time. The corset-making process itself was painstaking, from selecting the durable yet flexible fabrics like coutil, a tightly woven cotton specifically designed for corsetry, to stitching boning channels and attaching hooks. Each corset was a labor of love and precision. In many ways, the corset was a bespoke piece of art, a secret sculpture hidden beneath layers of clothing. It required skill to put on properly, sometimes needing assistance from a lady's maid or friend to tighten laces just right. And here's a curious modern fact: even in contemporary corsetry, authentic tight-lacing enthusiasts still seek out traditional materials and methods, valuing the craftsmanship as much as the aesthetic. They maintain communities dedicated to preserving these skills, blending history with personal expression. So, as you relax, now feel the hum of ancient sewing machines, the whisper of steel stays sliding into fabric channels, and the patient hands shaping a form that both confined and defined. The corset is more than a garment. It's a complex dialogue between human ingenuity, beauty, and constraint. As you continue drifting, let's slip into the quieter corners of corsetry history, the hidden social and psychological layers that corsets wove into Victorian life. You already know corsets shaped bodies, but did they also shape identities, power dynamics, and even self-perceptions? Imagine the daily ritual: waking up, reaching for the corset, and lacing it up inch by painstaking inch. This wasn't just about fashion, it was about becoming the person society expected you to be: refined, modest, elegant, and controlled. The corset acted like a physical script for femininity, instructing your posture, your breathing, even your behavior. Some historians argue that corsets functioned as tools of social control, reinforcing class distinctions and gender roles. The tighter the waist, the more you signaled adherence to elite norms. If you couldn't or wouldn't wear a corset, you risked social ostracism or accusations of impropriety. But others suggest a more nuanced view. Many women embraced corsetry as a source of pride, empowerment, and even comfort. The familiar pressure of the corset could feel reassuring, a protective armor in a world of social expectations. Some found the process of lacing and unlacing meditative, a moment of self-care wrapped in fabric and bone. The psychology behind fainting is especially intriguing. While it's easy to dismiss Victorian ladies swooning as mere melodrama, it might have been a complex interplay of physiological response and social signaling. Fainting could convey vulnerability, delicacy, and need for protection, traits idealized at the time. Remember, those smelling salts, they were part practical aid, part performance accessory, helping ladies recover just enough to maintain appearances. Historians still argue whether fainting was mostly accidental or sometimes deliberately employed to navigate social situations. Here's a curious detail: in some circles, women competed to achieve the smallest waist possible, turning tight lacing into a form of sport or status symbol. Corset piercings and waist training regimens became part of an unspoken competition, with some women pulling their laces tighter over years to reshape their bodies permanently. Yet tight lacing was not without its critics and risks. Medical professionals frequently warned against the practice, citing respiratory issues, digestive problems, and musculoskeletal damage. Still, women persisted, negotiating their own definitions of beauty and endurance. This social dance around the corset extended beyond the wearer. Men's perceptions of corseted women varied widely, from admiration and desire to disdain for perceived artificiality. The corset's presence was a constant backdrop in the delicate negotiation of Victorian gender politics. On a lighter note, some Victorian cartoons mocked the corset's influence with exaggerated waists and fainting fits, showing that even contemporaries poked fun at this obsession. Humor offered a subtle outlet for critiquing societal pressures without outright rebellion. In the end, the corset was more than an undergarment. It was a physical manifestation of the hopes, fears, and contradictions of an era, a garment that shaped bodies and stories. So, as you settle deeper into comfort, feel the soft tension of history wrapped around your ribs, reminding you how clothing can hold not just flesh, but also meaning. As you glide further into this gentle reflection, let's explore how corsetry influenced art and literature, shaping the Victorian imagination and beyond. Because you see, the corset was not just fabric and bones beneath a dress. It was a muse, a metaphor, and a character in countless stories. Picture yourself leafing through Victorian novels or gazing at portraits where women's corseted waists are emphasized as symbols of refinement, power, or sometimes entrapment. The corset's silhouette became shorthand for the ideals and contradictions of the age. In literature, corsets often appear as emblematic props. Authors used them to signify virtue repression or transformation. A heroine's tight-laced figure might symbolize her adherence to society's rules, or conversely, her struggle against them. Sometimes, a corset's removal marked liberation or vulnerability, moments heavy with emotional tension. Famous authors like Charlotte Bronte and Thomas Hardy included corsetry references to deepen character development or highlight social critique. The corset was never just about clothes. It was about identity power and the invisible chains binding individuals. Visual artists also played with the imagery. Paintings and prints exaggerated corseted forms, sometimes idealizing the hourglass figure, sometimes critiquing the unnatural constraints imposed on women. The corset's rigid lines and dramatic curves became a rich motif, both alluring and alarming. Interestingly, the corset inspired surreal and symbolic interpretations in early modernist art. For example, the notion of the corset was adapted to explore psychological confinement or societal pressures. Historians still argue whether these artistic uses represented rebellion or complicity. Here's a quirky cultural tidbit. In 19th century theater, corset dances became a popular performance where actresses would exaggerate the corset's restrictive nature, sometimes even pretending to faint or struggle out of them, blending comedy and social commentary. And in film and photography, corsetry was often used to set a period tone, evoking mystery, romance, or tension. Sometimes directors highlighted the physical challenges of wearing corsets to deepen character realism or drama. You might be surprised to learn that some Victorian corsets were designed with painted decorations or embroidery, turning the garment itself into an art piece meant to be glimpsed during intimate moments or secret rendezvous. The corset also found its way into feminist discourse, both historically and in modern reinterpretations. It served as a powerful symbol in debates about body autonomy, beauty standards, and women's rights, a physical battleground between self-expression and societal expectations. So, as your eyelids grow heavier, imagine the corset as a silent narrator weaving through pages and canvases, shaping stories and images that ripple through time. It's a symbol loaded with contradictions of beauty and pain, freedom and restraint, identity and illusion. And with that, you're ready to drift toward your dreams, carrying the soft echo of lace and steel, whispered through history's art and words. As you slip deeper into this calm nightscape, let's gently unravel the legacy of Victorian corsetry in today's world, how those laces and bones echo in modern fashion culture, and even the way we think about bodies and beauty. You might not realize it, but the corset's influence is everywhere, from haute couture runways to everyday shapewear. Modern garments like waist trainers, body shapers, and even some sports gear owe their ancestry to corsetry's obsession with form and control. Yet the conversation has changed. Today, there's much more emphasis on choice, comfort, and diversity. The ideal body shape has broadened beyond the narrow Victorian hourglass, celebrating a spectrum of sizes and styles. Still, the echoes of the past linger quietly, reminding us how fashion can shape identity and self-esteem. The resurgence of vintage styles, steampunk aesthetics, and alternative fashion scenes keeps the corset alive, not as a symbol of repression, but as an emblem of creativity and individuality. Enthusiasts experiment with fabrics, colors, and designs, transforming corsets into wearable art or statements of empowerment. Historians still argue whether modern corset use is a nostalgic homage or a radical reclaiming of feminine power. Is it a nod to tradition or a fresh rewriting of what it means to control one's body? On the health front, science and medicine have thankfully advanced, debunking many myths about corset dangers while warning against extreme tight lacing. The modern wearer often balances aesthetics with well-being, embracing comfort as a priority. And here's a quirky twist: some celebrities have openly credited waist trainers for their post-pregnancy body goals, sparking debates about the modern corset's place in popular culture and fitness. More broadly, the corset teaches us about the ongoing dance between fashion identity and society, how clothing can confine or free us, shape our bodies and stories, and mirror the times we live in. So, as you nestle further into the warmth of your covers, feel the gentle pull of history stitching through the night. The Victorian ladies who fainted over tight corsets were part of a vast, intricate tapestry, one you're now woven into. Breathe deeply. Let the threads of the past unwind softly around you and drift toward dreams free from constriction. The day's tight laces and whispered histories now dissolve into soft shadows. Imagine the slow, deliberate loosening of ribbons, the gentle release of pressure, the quiet sigh of fabric settling into silence. The air around you grows calm, the world slowing into a soft pulse like the beating of a distant, steady heart. Let your mind float lightly, untethered by form or expectation. The stories of corsets fainting and fashion fade gently into the background, becoming part of the quiet hum that lulls you deeper. Each breath is a tender unfolding, a gentle reminder that the past holds both weight and release. Feel your body relax free from any tightness, wrapped instead in the warm comfort of rest. Your thoughts wander like soft threads weaving through a delicate tapestry, catching the faintest glimmer of lace, the ghost of a ribbon's touch, the echo of a sigh long past. You are safe here in this quiet moment between waking and dreaming, cradled by history's gentle embrace. Let go completely. Drift away. Good night and sweet dreams.